Maybe as a start, you explain us how you came to this project. What was the motivation behind?
So I grew up in the northwest corner of Scotland, on the edge of a major NATO live bombing range. And so as a child, I experienced at certain times of the year fast Tornado GR4 jets would come screaming into the landscape to drop 1,000-pound live bombs just literally off the coast. And the impact of that on the kind of environment was that the sky, which this is a very sort of remote part of the world, the sky, which was vast and open, suddenly collapsed onto the top of our heads like an oppressive lid. But the sonic impact was also really visceral. So you would feel first the jets and then the bombs in your body. The other aspect of growing up at this time, on what was in a way a periphery, but also geopolitically a very sort of central location, because this landscape was used by NATO with these military exercises to prepare for conflict elsewhere. So it became a proxy landscape for other parts of the world. Was also the continual sense and anxiety about nuclear attack. So I grew up there at the time where there was a very heightened awareness that this threat could come at any time from a kind of invisible source. So for a very long time in my practice, I've been interested in the militarization of landscapes. And more recently, I was doing a lot of work in the Outer Hebrides on the edge of what they have there, which is a large weapons testing range for testing complex weapon systems. And weapons manufacturers use that space. And that's when I really started developing the research around topologies of air. So I was interested in the way that the military, in a sense, instrumentalize airspace and outer space. And the Kinetic, which is the company that rents the space out to arms manufacturers, describes the airspace as a sanitized airspace of unlimited altitude. And that description of the sky erases essentially the deep cultural and social and historical importance of the sky to those communities.
Whereas colonization was largely concerned with wealth extraction through occupation, neocolonization is largely concerned with data extraction through surveillance.
How did you then join forces with Professor Nick Grief, who has been working on human rights law for many decades?
Yeah. So at that time, the weapons testing range was planning to expand its territory quite significantly, and they had undertaken a consultation process. So part of the research for this art project that I was involved in involved looking at that process. And Nick happened to be a colleague of mine at the University of Kent, where I work. And Nick is an expert in international airspace law, international human rights law, and also the legal status of nuclear weapons. So I met him to talk about this Topologies of Air project, which was really at the beginning of the research, but had this sort of deep history in my childhood and in a lot of work that I'd worked on up until that point. And we met to talk about it, and he asked me why I was so interested in airspace. And when I described this environment, he talked about the fact that airspace law, international airspace law, really dates back to the 1940s, and outer space law to the 1960s and 70s. And the transformations airspace and outer space, and really what one could call a kind of, accelerating colonization of airspace and outer space by not just the military but corporations, means that we're living in a very, very different world now than we were when the legal framework was first established. So we decided that the human rights dimension of airspace and outer space urgently needs to be developed, and proposed or decided to set up the Airspace Tribunal, which is an international people's tribunal to consider the case for and against a proposed new human right to live without physical or psychological threat from above.
So you are tackling climate change, also surveillance and the military attacks, all coming from above.
Yeah.
And what is sort of like the idea now with this project? What are kind of the next steps after you got, all the material collected at the airspace tribunals? You published this double special issue of the journal Digital War, and now there are lawyers also working on the briefs, which will explain what are the deficiencies with the existing laws. So what are the next steps for your project now?
I think one thing I should say that's incredibly important to my practice and to the exhibition here, the artwork in the exhibition and the project of the Airspace Tribunal, is they are all interconnected. And, I see the relationship between human rights and art practice as a really kind of closely interconnected one in terms of my work and practice. And partly because, human rights need to evolve in order to be relevant to the times in which, they're functioning. And art practice, I see it as a kind of extraordinarily valuable space for critical reflection and engagement with the contemporary world that we live in. And in my own practice, collaboration with other people, particularly other knowledges, people working in other disciplines, has always been really central. And so I see this very much as a kind of shared project in a sense. And of course we work very closely together. We've worked very closely together since the first, definitely the hearing that you presented at, and also moving forward. So the next stages are really for us and the kind of network of people who've contributed and shaped the proposal through the hearings that we've had. The next stage is to prepare the proposal to submit to the UN, the Council of Europe. And also, because it's very much also a civil society initiative, the whole international airspace, the People's Tribunal challenges the traditional state-centric view of how international law is created. The process has been to make visible the threats, to better understand the threats, to find a way of conceptualizing
and
them.
you are visualizing them in an effective way so that people can see, what is happening, with the algorithms which are guiding the autonomous weapons. You're also showing in the show very well the surveillance linked to numerous satellites, also the sort of the question of who will take care of the satellites which are malfunctioning, which stop functioning, which is a big ecological project that no one is actually dealing with. And also you are very well in a way showing also how victims are living with the traumas. So in your film, what I like is that you interviewed the victims from various wars. Very moving. I find the survivors of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who are now like in their late 80s, but they were, children when the bomb struck their city. And actually, it was in the morning when they went to school, just a little bit after 8. And for me, the shocking part is how, for 80 plus years, these people have lived with this trauma, often not speaking about it. And they opened up to you, where they spoke about the need to kind of engage in a coordinated international action against nuclear weapons. And also when you see then victims of wars in the Middle East, especially you have some victims from Syria, you know, who are now helping other victims. You see the psychological element, which is often not thought through in the debates about the dangers, you know, because you point out the anticipatory anxiety that people have when there are constant drones, you know, or dangers that, you know, someone might attack them from the air, or also the climate change is also creating this anxiety, you know, inability to breathe.
They want outside of the body, and they want to live in a digital environment, a digital diaspora.
Humans need protecting. We've got an air gap. We've always lived with an air gap, which is simply the unconnected world. The ability to exist, to breathe the air, to live, to conduct your activities of any kind in any way you want without any form of connectivity, surveillance or control.
One should be free to look up into the air without the danger that something will fall onto you and kill you, or free also to breathe the air, which is also part of the airspace, outer space. So I understand correctly, if I understand correctly, your idea is that we have to kind of revive the idea of human rights, because they have been sort of pushed aside in today's times, where it appears that many of the rights that we adopted after World War II would not have been, you know, adopted today in this very divided work. So, like, why human rights now? What would be your sort of an answer?
I think what you describe is the interconnected nature of all of these threats, and it's compounding. And you're absolutely right. One of the areas, and particularly within the current legal framework, there's very little recognition or provision for psychological harm, which we know affects individuals, but also whole communities and also future generations, because it's transgenerational, it passes down. So just returning very quickly to Hiroshima, I think one of the really important dimensions of speaking to the survivors or hibakusha in Hiroshima is to consider the bombing of Hiroshima not as enclosed in a past history, but to think about its recurring and long-term effects, and how that knowledge and that experience needs to be listened to in order for us to address the current threats that we are seeing now with a kind of rapidly expanding nuclearism. I mean, we're even seeing now the possibility of nuclear weapons in space.
We are, at the moment, being poisoned on a daily basis. There is maybe some connection to be made between the atmosphere up here, from which things can fall on us, as it were, and the atmosphere around us, which can infiltrate and destroy us. The language of human rights is among the very last of the languages available to us to fill a gap in our understanding of the world, which is rooted in equality, esteem, and empathy.
Humanity has been altering the air, the atmosphere for thousands of years.
These are really hugely challenging issues.
And the desires to mine for precious materials maybe in the future.
Yeah,
when there will be a solution to how to power, this kind of enterprises.
Exactly, and this kind of space expansionism driven by corporations, driven by constant competition between states. The one thing it does is it excludes the human being on the ground. And human beings are not just isolated. They come with their environments, they come with ecologies, they're part of life. And I think human rights as a language and as a principle that is based on equality, it's based on human dignity, it's based on thinking about how all of this activity that is happening here is impacting people on the ground is absolutely fundamental, and it couldn't be more needed now.
Yeah.
And it is such an important, even a language. I mean, of course, we are working together to push for the human right to be recognized. But
so the first important thing is that, often in the discussions about human rights at space, the question is whether human rights end with the airspace. Do the human rights also pertain to the outer space? It's kind of theoretical debate, which has been, I think, solved in the way that majority of legal theories now think that it is us humans who are, exploring the outer space, which is why outer space doesn't have, their own, let's say, representatives to protect them, and it is us responsible for what is happening, to the outer space, but also to humans, exploring outer space and humans who might be damaged by whatever happens in the outer space. So I think more and more the agreement is that human rights do pertain to outer space, although there are no humans yet there, to whom
I think
they would play a role.
Yeah, I think the principle of human rights in relation to outer space is that we are absolutely all dependent on outer space increasingly.
Sure.
Each person uses outer space 30 or 40 times a day. Our whole infrastructures, our transport systems, our governance structures, our health structures are increasingly dependent on outer space, on satellites, exactly, and on hardware in outer space. And so, but as we know, the outer space treaties are not holding in that way, and the human rights dimension of this aspect of the use of outer space, and as you said, the potential harm that comes from that use is not considered. And so this is a very important dimension.
And many countries are now planning to do, bilateral agreements, like United States, many European countries, which will allow the, potential, economic exploitation of the outer space or military.
Yeah.
And that means that there are lots of questions in the domain of international law.
Yeah.
And as you said, this international law that regulates outer space has been very old, from the late 60s, when we didn't have artificial intelligence and the type of surveillance that we live in today.
The one other thing I'd quite like to say about that is to do with those laws that you were talking about, the airspace law and outer space law. Particularly airspace law is a kind of it's built on more of a Cartesian model of territory. Then we have the distinction, which in a way is a very abstract and almost arbitrary line between airspace and outer space as a regime. The reason why the proposed new human right is the freedom to live without physical or psychological threat from above is that it's based on the idea that this could be something that comes from 2 feet above your head or from outer space. It isn't making this, in a way, artificial separation.
Yeah.
And I think that's is also very important, because if we think about contemporary warfare and militarization is seeping into every part of our lives. And, you know, militaries now talk about all-domain war. You know, that it's very difficult to know when wars begin and end. So I think those are also very important shifts.
Yeah, and
thinking.
Our project has looked also at the fact that civilians are not protected.
Yeah.
And there has been a problem also in kind of defining civilians. You know, quite often in today's wars they are perceived as collateral damage.
Yeah.
Let's say AI-operated weapons might decide that certain number of civilians is an you know, sacrifice when they are going after someone that is called a terrorist or you know, dangerous person in one way or another, or they are perceived as bearers of data. You know, we have telephones all the time with us. We are collecting data every moment of our lives. Sometimes we are willingly sharing it with the military. Sometimes the state, you know, takes it from us, or corporations for whichever purposes. We don't know about those purposes. And quite often humans are also perceived as kind of human shields. You know, not as civilians, but as someone who is, you know, kind of a, let's say, guarding potentially dangerous people who, you know, might be targeted. And we need to return to the problem of like the subjectivity, the idea of humanity, and actually revive the idea of human rights. Human rights have always been a battleground, you know. What is the right? Can we expand the rights? And from the start, human rights have been expanding, you know. Only in the 80s, let's say, the idea emerged that we need to protect children. So children's rights are, you know, much kind of a newer phenomenon. And of course, you know, the ideas of who on top of humans need to be protected, you know, animal rights and so on. And that's why human rights are, you know, sort of expanding by itself through public debate. So this project is a place for a public debate to think through whether, you know, these threats linked to outer space, airspace, which is especially linked to the development of AI and, you know, the expansion of the surveillance, whether, you know, this development requires a new human right, or in some way also the fight for a new human right in some way might have as a kind of a collateral certain changes in legislation, you know, which is sort of in charge of the future developments of, you know, outer space explorations, exploitations. And I think that that's why it might take a long time for this human right to come to fruition. We shouldn't forget that the last human right needed 10 years of international research, debates, political will. Often it is civil society organizations and small countries which are sort of proposing a new human right. So this last human right dealt with the right to sustainable development. And that tackles, to a point, also climate change. So our proposed human rights goes a little bit further here to also bring into account, you know, the surveillance, the military, especially linked to the outer
and the
space.
Psychological impact.
And the psychological, So the psychological elements, the threats, how they impact the psyche of the individuals, that has been often pushed aside in the international law and also in the sort of, let's say, human rights law. And that's why we are kind of bringing to the forefront, you know, not only physical harm to the individual, but the psychic. Long-term trauma, which is often intergenerational, transgenerational, and also the anxiety, fear that people have in regard to the threats.
Absolutely.